On the night of August 21st, 1986, families living beneath a beautiful mountain lake in Cameroon went to sleep. By morning, entire households were dead. Cattle, they lay motionless in the fields. Birds, they had fallen from trees. People, they collapsed beside roads. In some homes, nothing looked damaged at all. I mean, there was no fire, there was no flood, there was no lava, there was no collapsed building. There was no obvious sign of what had happened. Many of the victims had simply stopped breathing because sometime during the night, this lake released an enormous cloud of carbon dioxide. The gas was invisible. It was heavier than the surrounding air, and once it escaped the lake, it began moving downhill into valleys, into homes, into villages, toward people who had absolutely no idea anything was coming. Roughly 1,700 people would pass away. Thousands of animals, they would die with them. And when scientists finally arrived, they were confronted with a question that sounded impossible. How does a lake kill people? This is Lake Nyos. And 40 years ago, this month, it became one of the deadliest lakes on Earth. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Yore Town podcast. The voice you're hearing, it's me, it's Matt, it's Beardlaws, and sitting across from me is unfortunately nobody. No Dun Queen, the beautiful, lovely Meg this week. The wife and the kids are camping. Thankfully, not near a lake, by a river, and you just have me. So if you're only here for the Dun Queen and the husband and wife banter, I want to apologize and get it out of the way that you're here with me. But if you want to hear about a lake that killed a lot of people, which sounds crazy, well, it's pretty crazy. So let's jump into this right now, because Lake Nyos sits in the highlands of northwestern Cameroon. And from above, it is almost ridiculously beautiful. Yeah, it's beautiful. Well, it is that blue-green water. It's beautiful. We came up with another new word. Blue-green water, steep green walls, farm country, small communities scattered through the valleys below. Nothing about the view tells you that the lake is sitting inside the crater of an ancient volcanic explosion. And nothing about the surface tells you what was accumulating hundreds of feet beneath it. Lake Nyos is deep, roughly 210 meters at its deepest point. That's more, for any of those that aren't great at math, that's more than 680 feet. That's like almost six football fields, to put that in perspective. Like American football, not football. Anyways, unlike many ordinary lakes, its deep water does not mix freely with the water near the surface. It is permanently layered. That mattered more than anyone living nearby could possibly have known at the time. All right, let me put it this way. Imagine a bottle of soda. Carbon dioxide is dissolved inside the liquid, and as long as the bottle stays sealed and pressure remains high, much of that gas, it stays dissolved. But if you open the bottle and reduce the pressure, bubbles suddenly appear. Well, Lake Nyos had become something like a gigantic natural soda bottle, except inside of a plastic cap holding everything in, hundreds of feet of water were doing the job. Carbon dioxide from deep geological sources beneath the volcanic region slowly entered the bottom of the lake, and under the pressure of all that water, the gas dissolved year after year, layer after layer. The lake, it just kept storing it quietly. Nobody looking at the lake from shore could see any of this. There was no permanent cloud hanging over. There was no bubbling surface announcing danger. There was no warning sign. The threat existed mostly where people could not see it. At the bottom, right where nobody could see. And by 1986, there were an enormous amount of gas trapped down there. Scientists later estimated the disaster released hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon dioxide. Some estimates put the total volume of released gas at a fraction of a cubic kilometer to as much as around 1 cubic kilometer. That's an amount almost impossible to visualize. So forget the number for a second. Think about the effect. Enough invisible gas escaped this lake to fill surrounding valleys and displace the oxygen people needed to stay alive. And almost nobody saw it coming. So you're probably thinking, like I was when I was looking at this, what triggered the disaster? Well, it's still debated. And I feel like that distinction matters because scientists understand what killed people. They understand where the gas came from. They understand why the lake was capable of storing so much of it. But the precise event that started the catastrophic release on August 21st has never been established with absolute certainty. And a landslide has long been discussed as one of the possible triggers. Other researchers have considered spontaneous instability that was in the lake itself. What is clear, though, is that something disrupted the deep, gas-rich water. Once that water began moving upward, the physics became terrifying. As if physics isn't terrifying enough. I never got to take physics. It was never. I probably did. Anyways, as gas-rich water rose toward the surface, pressure then dropped. Lower pressure allowed dissolved carbon dioxide to form bubbles. Those bubbles made the rising water more buoyant. That caused more water to rise, which released more gas, which pulled more water upward. A runaway chain reaction had begun. The lake essentially began uncorking itself, and once enough carbon dioxide reached the surface, there was no putting it back. A massive cloud of gas, it spilled out over the lake and surrounding terrain. Some people nearby reportedly heard a violent sound. Others apparently noticed nothing before losing consciousness. The cloud then moved away from the lake and downhill into lower terrain. This is where carbon dioxide became especially deadly. CO2 it's denser than ordinary air, so rather than simply just disappearing upward immediately, concentrated cloud just kind of hugged the ground and collected in low places like valleys, like depressions, low-lying homes. Exactly where many people around the lake lived. The USGS descriptions of the disaster explain that the gas flowed downhill and asphyxiated people in the surrounding area. And because carbon dioxide is colorless, the cloud had, well, no visible edge. There was no dark wall moving through the valley. There was no smoke, no flames. People couldn't not look outside and see danger approaching. The atmosphere itself had changed. The medical evidence collected afterward is the most unsettling parts of this entire story. Because researchers, they later studied hundreds of survivors, and the pattern was consistent with exposure to a powerful asphyxiant. And people reported sudden unconsciousness. There was confusion, there was weaknesses, breathing problems, and some survivors, they woke up hours later with no idea what had happened. Some discovered relatives around them who had passed away. Some were found among dead livestock. Medical teams also documented unusual skin changes and injuries in survivors, some of which were likely related from the prolonged unconsciousness and exposure during the event. Imagine just waking up after something like that. You don't remember an explosion. You don't remember a building collapse. You don't remember being attacked. You just wake up and everything around you is silent. You look around, your animals are dead. Your neighbors are dead. Some of your family members are dead. And nobody can tell you why. This right there is what makes Lake Nyos so difficult to process. Most disasters, they leave clues, fires, they leave ash, floods, they leave mud, storms, they tear apart buildings, earthquakes, they split roads. This disaster, it left homes standing. The killer had passed through and just vanished. And then when rescuers and officials reached the affected communities, they encountered scenes that did not make immediate sense. People and animals, they had died across the landscape, but there was little physical destruction. The lake itself had changed. It is normally like blue water and, had become kind of discolored after deep mineral-rich water was brought toward the surface. Vegetation around parts of the lake had been disturbed, but nothing resembled the aftermath of a conventional volcanic eruption. This created an immediate mystery. Had there been a volcanic eruption? Had poisonous sulfur gas escaped? Had something exploded underground? Could the water itself maybe have been contaminated? I mean, investigators from Cameroon and international scientific teams, they all arrived, and they were trying to figure out what exactly had happened. So the United States Geological Survey eventually produced a major scientific report on the August 21st disaster. Researchers, they studied the lake water, the gas chemistry, geology, victim patterns, the surrounding terrain, anything that could explain how so many people had died while so little around them had been physically destroyed. Again, the answer wasn't lava, not ash, not a traditional eruption. It was carbon dioxide. The lake had released it in a concentration high enough to make the air around victims unbreathable. I mean, carbon dioxide did not need to poison people in the conventional sense, right? At a high enough concentration, it simply displaced the oxygen that they needed. People, they suffocated in open air, which it's almost impossible to imagine, isn't it? And then scientists realized something that made Lake Nyos even more disturbing. It wasn't the first time, because 2 years earlier, August 15th, 1984, another lake in Cameroon had killed people. Lake Nyos. 37 people died after a sudden release of gas from the lake. At the time, researchers were still working to understand exactly what had happened there. The event was obviously bizarre. It was very small. It was very remote and easy for most of the world to simply ignore. Then Lake Nyos happened. And suddenly that small disaster, it looked like a warning. When you had two lakes, same country, same strange mechanism, same invisible killer, only the second time, unfortunately, the scale was catastrophic. That is one of the biggest retention turns in this story, because until now, Lake Nyos sounds like a freak accident, one impossible night. But the other lake tells us it wasn't unique. There was an entire kind of natural disaster scientists were only beginning to recognize. A lake could quietly collect volcanic carbon dioxide for years, then release it all at once. And now researchers had to ask a pretty uncomfortable question. How many other lakes could do the same thing? And let's be clear about something. Not every volcanic lake is capable of becoming another Lake Nyos. The conditions have to be unusually specific. The lake, it needs to be deep enough, stable enough, stratified enough, and connected to a continuing underground source of gas. At Lake Nyos, the deep layers remain isolated from surface. Mixing in carbon dioxide, it enters from below and dissolves into the deepest water under pressure. That gas is allowed to build faster than the lake can safely release it. The reservoir, it grows. That is why researchers continued measuring Lake Nyos for years after the disaster. The 1986 event did not shut off the geological carbon dioxide supply. The lake, it began accumulating gas again. I mean, think about how horrifying that realization is. Scientists have finally solved the mystery. They knew what had happened. They knew why it happened. And then they discovered the lake was rebuilding the same conditions. Lake Nyos was reloading slowly, quietly again. So this part right here, this is the part where the story takes one of the strangest turns. You cannot drain an entire crater lake every few years. You cannot shut off the geology beneath it. Scientists and engineers, they came up with another idea. Release the gas deliberately, slowly, before the lake can release it catastrophically. Beginning in 2001, controlled degassing began at Lake Nyos. Engineers, they lowered a pipe deep into the gas-rich water. Once water was brought upward through the pipe and pressure dropped, carbon dioxide began to bubble out. That bubbling made the water rise even faster. So after the system was started, the gas itself helped drive the flow. At the surface, the pipe produced a huge fountain of water and carbon dioxide. And USGS, They even had photos that showed fountains reaching roughly 100 feet into the air during the degassing. Look at the irony, right? In 1986, the goal would have been to keep the gas inside the lake. After scientists understood the danger, the goal began getting it out on purpose, but slowly, kind of like, your uncle after Thanksgiving dinner. But maybe it's not as slow. Anyways, controlled release instead of catastrophe was the move. It was the plan. Additional work expanded the degassing effort because early modeling showed that a single pipe wouldn't remove the accumulated gas quickly enough. This might be my favorite visual moment in the entire documentary. You have this peaceful blue lake, and in the middle of it all, a giant pipe blasting water into the sky, like a lake bidet for the sky. Maybe it's not like that. Anyways, because humanity essentially installed the pressure release valve into a natural disaster. Kind of smart, right? Mostly safer does not mean permanently harmless, though, right? More recent scientific work shows that controlled degassing substantially reduced the danger at Lake Nyos, but the geological supply of carbon dioxide continues. Researchers have emphasized that continued monitoring does remain necessary because gas still enters the deep water. That's a pretty important distinction. It wasn't cured. Scientists just kind of learned how to manage it. The danger is now something that can be measured, tracked, reduced, but definitely not forgotten. And the legacy of this lake extends far beyond Cameroon. Researchers now look at gas-rich volcano lakes much differently because of what had happened there. Lake Nyos changed our understanding of how lakes can store and suddenly release enormous quantities of gas. I just want to pause for a minute and, applaud myself. Yes, there's been a couple of jokes, but a guy my age growing up when I did, and all these gas jokes, I haven't let one rip. Back to the story. The disaster became the defining example of what is now commonly called a limnic eruption or lake overturn gas disaster. There's another lake scientist that watches very closely because there's another one, Lake Kivu. It sits between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. It contains enormous amounts of dissolved carbon dioxide and methane. Millions of people live around it, researchers. They do not say that this lake is about to do what Lake Nyos did because the lake is different. Its gas system is different, but Lake Nyos permanently changed how scientists think about what gas-rich lakes are capable of doing. I mean, Lake Nyos was the proof. A lake could kill an entire valley without flooding it. That's terrifying. There's one part of the disaster that sounds simple until you think about it. Why didn't people run? The answer is that many probably never had the chance. Carbon dioxide at extremely high concentrations can cause rapid loss of consciousness. And because the cloud entered low terrain, people, they may not have been overwhelmed before they even understood that anything was wrong. I mean, just imagine you wake up in darkness. You feel a little bit dizzy. Maybe you're a little bit confused. Maybe a little bit short of breath. But there's no visible smoke. There's no fire outside. There's no sirens. You stand up, and the air itself is the problem. I mean, where do you run? Up? I mean, that would have been the safest direction, higher ground, because the dense gas was pooling below. But you would have needed to understand that while you were already being deprived of oxygen, and that was something that nobody knew at the time. And that's why this disaster feels almost unfair. Most natural hazards, they give you some clue about what you're supposed to escape. Water, get higher, fire, move away, storm, find shelter. A ground-hugging cloud of invisible carbon dioxide. I mean, you can't fight something you don't know is there, right? I mean, around 1,700 people passed away. A frequently cited, precise count is 1,746. More than 3,000 livestock also passed away. Different scientific and government sources sometimes round those numbers, which is why most of the time you're going to see about 1,700. Some other reports, a more exact figure in others, right? And this is where I do not want us to turn the number into a spectacle, because 1,700 is too large for our brains to really understand. So think smaller. One house, one family, one animal that maybe was tied up outside, one neighbor, one child. Now duplicate that across the entire community, multiple communities. I mean, the scale becomes horrifying. People, they do not die because the lake exploded through their houses. They died because the place they had always lived decided that the air was going to just simply change around them. And that's what makes this geography so important. The lake was up there. The villages were down there. And gravity, well, did the rest. And today, Lake Nyos, it's still beautiful. That is almost offensive after everything we've talked about today, right? I mean, you look at the photos and it still looks peaceful. Green crater walls, blue water, clouds moving over the hills. Nothing about the surface says this place killed roughly 1,700 people. The degassing equipment, it tells part of the story. Scientific instruments, they tell part of the story. But if you didn't know what had happened here, you could look at this lake and think it was simply another stunning volcanic landscape. And that may be the most Yore Town thing about Lake Nyos, right? The place doesn't look evil, doesn't look haunted, doesn't look dangerous. It looks beautiful. The story is hidden underneath, literally hundreds of feet underneath. And scientists, they know what came out of the lake. Carbon dioxide. They know where much of the carbon dioxide even came from. Geological sources that were beneath the volcanic region. They understand how deep water stored the gas. They understand how releasing pressure could turn dissolved CO2 into bubbles and create a runaway eruption. That's kind of a cool band name, Runaway Eruption. Focus. But there is still one question that does not have a universally accepted final answer. Why did it happen that night? Why August 21st? Why then? A landslide, like I mentioned before, remains one proposed trigger. Internal instability in the lake, it's another possibility. The scientific literature, I mean, has debated the, initiating mechanism for decades. And I love that for the ending of this story, not because mystery is better than science. Science solved the important part. We know what killed the victims. We know how to reduce the danger. But nature did not leave us a security camera. We can reconstruct the catastrophe. We cannot replay the first second. Somewhere on August 21st, 1986, something changed. Water moved, pressure dropped, bubbles formed. Once that chain reaction began, an entire valley was about to learn that a lake could breathe. 40 years ago, people beneath this lake went to sleep, expecting to wake up the next morning. Most had no reason to fear the water above them. The lake had been there before they were even born. It watered the landscape. It was part of the geography, part of home. Then one night, the thing beneath the surface, it escaped. There was no fireball that crossed the sky. No wall of water came down the valley, and no monster crawled from the lake. Just carbon dioxide, a gas already present in the air around every one of us, but concentrated enough. It replaced the air people needed to breathe. By morning, roughly 1,700 people were gone. Over 3,000 livestock also gone. And the world had discovered an entirely new kind of disaster. Today, pipes they rise from Lake Nyos because scientists learn how to make the lake release its gas before the gas can release itself. The danger has been dramatically reduced, but the carbon dioxide source that is beneath the lake, far beneath the lake, has not simply vanished. The place still requires watching. And maybe that right there is why Lake Nyos remains so unsettling. We tend to think dangerous places look dangerous. A burning volcano, collapsing mine, a flooded town, a ruined building. Lake Nyos does not. It looks like somewhere that you would stop to take a picture. It looks like somewhere you'd maybe find an Airbnb or a campground or a vacation destination. Some people, they want to retire on this lake. 40 years ago, that beautiful lake silently filled the valleys beneath it. Something that nobody could see. The homes remained physically strong. The roads, they remained. The mountains, they remained. The lake remained. Thousands of people and animals, they did not. The place survived its own disaster. And if nobody had figured out what had happened, it could have happened again. This is Lake Nyos, Cameroon. A beautiful lake with an unbelievable story hidden beneath its surface. And that is Yore Town. The strange, dark, and unbelievable true stories of real places. I can't thank you enough for taking some time out of your busy day, your busy week, your busy year to give this a listen. I do apologize again. If you made it here, you're the real MVP because you had to listen to me the entire episode and not the beautiful Meg. But she will be back next week. I know the week before she said, yeah, same time, same place, but she deserves a break every once in a while. Maybe I do too. But either way, let me know in whatever comments you're listening or watching this on. Would you have moved if you survived this? If your family had given you a camp on Lake Nyos, would you still own this camp to this very day? Curious what your thoughts are. Again, another small town, big story. This has been the Yore Town Podcast. We'll be back same time, same place next week. Again, can't thank you enough. Take care, everybody.